اللبنانيون يحتاجون إلى خارطة طريق.
Good afternoon and thank you for joining us on Future Television. I'm Linda Tamim and these are today's top stories. Violence spirals in Gaza as Israeli troops continue their military campaign on the Palestinian enclave for a 26th day. Egypt's President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi says a ceasefire plan proposed by his country offered the chance to end the Gaza conflict between Israel and Hamas, but warns that lost time further complicates matters. And former Prime Minister Saad Hariri praises Saudi King Abdullah's speech, slamming terrorism in the region and the international silence on Israel's offensive on Gaza. Israel has renewed shells on Gaza after accusing Hamas of destroying a humanitarian ceasefire by capturing a soldier whom the Islamists say was probably killed in Israeli shelling. Israeli aircraft have struck a major university and other targets in the Gaza Strip. A large part of the Islamic University in Gaza City was damaged, but no casualties were reported in the strike. The Israeli army said it targeted a weapon development center in the university. Shifa Mosque, one of Gaza City's largest mosques, was also badly damaged by an Israeli strike. The attacks came as Israel pounded the southern Gaza town of Rafah, killing 35 people, according to Palestinian health officials. Reporters on the ground say Israeli forces sealed off the eastern Rafah area and warned that cars on the streets will be considered potential targets. The recent events come a day after the United States Congress approved $225 million for Israel's Iron Dome anti-missile defense system, credited with destroying missiles fired by Hamas before they could reach their targets. Egypt's President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi says a ceasefire plan proposed by his country offered the chance to end the Gaza conflict between Israel and Hamas, but warned that lost time further complicated matters. Sisi's comments came at a joint press conference in Cairo with Italian Prime Minister Matteo Renzi. Officials say a Palestinian Liberation Organization delegation was due to fly from Jordan into Cairo for talks. Exiled officials from Hamas and the Islamic Jihad militant group will also join the negotiations. But following a breakdown of a truce on Friday, Hamas officials in Gaza will not attend. Hamas leaders said any Egypt-brokered deal must include an end to Israel's blockade of Gaza and called for Cairo to ease curbs at its Rafah crossing. Reports say it was not immediately clear whether an Israeli team will also participate, with a decision expected on the matter this evening. Syrian militants have kidnapped 2 Lebanese soldiers in the northeast town of Arsal. This is according to local reports, who add that mass Syrian gunmen have infiltrated Lebanon through Arsal. Media reports say the armed men deployed near Arsal police station and an army checkpoint. The men reportedly have links to the Al-Qaeda-inspired Nusra Front. The moves comes in light of reports saying that the army apprehended a Syrian man who was identified as Abu Ahmed Jum'a. The man gave the Lebanese army an ultimatum until 5 p.m. to release Jum'a, who is allegedly affiliated to an Islamic group. Former Prime Minister Saad Hariri says Saudi King Abdullah's speech slamming terrorism in the region and the international silence on Israel's offensive on Gaza was historic and very important. Hariri hailed the address because he says it accurately reflects the painful reality ravaging the Arab region due to the growing phenomenon of terrorism that hides under the cloak of Islam. In his speech, King Abdullah said extremist Islamist groups were killing innocent people and mutilating their bodies in contravention of Islamic teachings, and described Israel's aggression on Gaza as a war crime and state-sponsored terrorism. Hariri also congratulated the Saudi king on Eid al-Fitr, along with several Saudi officials. Education Minister Ilyas Boussab says he will hand students school affidavits as an alternative to graduating if teachers remain adamant on boycotting the grading of official exams due to the deadlock over the salary scale bill. Teachers who are part of the Union Coordination Committee have vowed to boycott marking official exams until Parliament passes the public sector wage hike bill. However, differences among lawmakers have lingered over means to finance the draft law, estimated to cost the Treasury some $1.2 billion per year. At least 50 jihadists from the Islamic State and al-Nusra Front were killed overnight by Syrian troops backed by Hezbollah fighters near the Lebanese border. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says the jihadists clashed throughout last night and into this morning with the regime troops and allied forces in the Kalamoun region. A local chief of al-Qaeda's Syrian affiliate, the Nusra Front, has died in an apparent assassination after a bomb went off in his car. An activist group says 2 of his sons were wounded in the blast. And coming up next, the World Health Organization warns that the Ebola outbreak is out of control. Stay tuned. Welcome back. The World Health Organization's chief, Margaret Chan, has warned that West Africa's Ebola outbreak, which killed more than 700 people since February, is spreading quicker than efforts to contain the disease. Chan urged the presidents of Guinea, Liberia, Sierra Leone and Ivory Coast at a meeting in Guinea's capital, Conakry, to step up efforts to avoid catastrophic consequences after the Global Health Organization announced a $100 million plan to combat an epidemic. She says the outbreak is by far the largest in the 4-year history of the disease, with 729 deaths so far, including more than 60 healthcare workers and 1,323 cases overall. Experience showed that the outbreak could be stopped and the general public was not at high risk of infection, but she added it would be extremely unwise to let the virus circulate widely over a long period of time. Director of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, Professor Peter Pyatt, says the disease is not being adequately addressed.
Well, this is the largest and longest outbreak of Ebola hemorrhagic fever in history, involving 3 countries, people in capitals. It is crossing borders, and I think the response up to now has not been firm enough. And we should see also that this is happening against the background of countries that are very poor, that have gone through civil war, decades of civil war sometimes, where there is a distrust in health services, in authorities, and that makes it particularly difficult to control this epidemic, which is based on isolating people, so quarantine, making sure that anybody who got in touch with a patient with Ebola is followed and maybe also isolated. Persons who are highest at risk are those who care for a patient with Ebola. Nurses, doctors, family members. That's where you see the highest attack rate, as we call it in epidemiology. Secondly, it is through dirty needles and syringes and needles that are being reutilized, and that can also transmit Ebola virus just as it can transmit hepatitis virus, for example. But there are experimental drugs and even vaccines that have proven to work in animals, and they would be extremely useful in case of a next epidemic. And the only way to find out whether they really work is to use them in humans. But first we need to make sure that there are, the safety of these drugs is guaranteed. So we need to accelerate the development of these drugs.
And still on the issue, President Barack Obama says the United States is taking risks from the deadly virus very seriously, and that some participants at an African summit taking place in Washington will be screened for exposure.
This has been a more aggressive Ebola outbreak than we've seen in the past, but keep in mind that it is still affecting parts of 3 countries, and we've got some 50 countries represented at this summit. We are doing 2 things. With respect to the summit itself, we're taking the appropriate precautions. Folks who are coming from these countries that have even a marginal risk or an infinitesimal risk of having been exposed in some fashion, we're making sure we're doing screening on that end as they leave the country. We'll do additional screening when we're here. We feel confident that the procedures that we've put in place are appropriate.
And now for news around the world in brief. 35 people have been injured, 4 of them seriously, when a passenger train collided with a freight train late last night near Mannheim station in southern Germany. The accident led to the derailment of 5 carriages of the passenger train, which was taking some 250 people between Graz in Austria and the German city of Saarbrücken near the French border. An explosion has killed 65 people as it ripped through a factory in eastern China, injuring 150 in what happened to be an industrial accident. CCTV says the blast in Kunshan occurred this morning at a factory which is involved in the production of car parts, including for U.S. automotive companies. The U.S. House of Representatives has passed a Republican bill to reverse President Barack Obama's policy of suspending deportations of undocumented residents who were brought to the United States illegally by their parents when they were children. By a vote of 216 to 192, the House passed the bill that also would stop Obama from expanding his policy to other groups of undocumented immigrants. Well, still on Obama, the president has acknowledged that his country has tortured al-Qaeda detainees captured after the 9/11 attacks in some of his most expansive comments to date about a controversial set of CIA practices that he banned after taking office. Addressing the impending release of a Senate report that criticizes CIA treatment of detainees, Obama said he believed the mistreatment happened because of the pressure national security officials felt to forestall another attack. He said Americans should not be too sanctimonious about passing judgment through the lens of a seemingly safer present day. To this day, many of those officials insist that what they did was not torture, which is a felony under U.S. law. Still, Obama did not address two other central arguments of the soon-to-be-released Senate report: that the brutal interrogations didn't produce life-saving intelligence, and that the CIA lied to other elements of the U.S. government about what exactly it was doing.
With respect to the larger point of the RDI report itself, even before I came into office, I was very clear that in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, we did some things that were wrong. We did a whole lot of things that were right, but we tortured some folks. We did some things that were contrary to our values. I understand why it happened. I think it's important when we look back to recall how afraid people were after the Twin Towers fell and the Pentagon had been hit and the plane in Pennsylvania had fallen, and people did not know whether more attacks were imminent. And there was enormous pressure on our law enforcement and our national security teams to try to deal with this. It's important for us not to feel too sanctimonious in retrospect about the tough job that those folks had. And a lot of those folks were working hard under enormous pressure and are real patriots. But having said all that, we did some things that were wrong.
This marks the end of our bulletin for today. Now for a reminder of our headlines. Violence spirals in Gaza as Israeli troops continue their military campaign on the Palestinian enclave for a 26th day. Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi says a ceasefire plan proposed by his country offered the chance to end the Gaza conflict between Israel and Hamas, but warns that lost time further complicates matters. And finally, former Prime Minister Saad Hariri praises Saudi King Abdullah's speech, slamming terrorism in the region and the international silence on Israel's offensive on Gaza. Those are your Saturday headlines from us here at Future Television. I'm Linda Tamim, and I wish you all a very nice weekend.
اللبنانيون يحتاجون إلى خارطة طريق